It was a freezing morning in late November when Grace pushed open the diner door at the corner of Maple Street. A small bell jingled above her head as a wave of warmth rushed out to greet her. Her hand was tightly wrapped around her little girl's fingers, a fragile hand that trembled not just from the cold, but from everything life had taken from her. Her name was Lily. 3 years old. Blue eyes as bright as the sky after rain, yet dull from hunger and sleepless nights. The moment they stepped inside, Lily's gaze danced around the diner, the smell of pancakes, the hiss of coffee brewing, the gentle clatter of plates. For a moment, it felt like another world. Grace led her daughter to a corner booth, far from the other customers. Her worn coat hung heavy on her shoulders, her shoes soaked from the long walk through the frost. The car they'd been sleeping in had finally given up that morning, its engine dead and silent. That car had been their last bit of shelter after losing their apartment, their last piece of something that still felt like home. She hadn't come to the diner to eat. She came for warmth, just a few minutes of pretending that they still belonged somewhere. Grace had a few coins in her pocket, not enough for even a cup of coffee. She prayed no one would ask her to leave. Lily pressed her hands against the table, watching the waitress move from one booth to another. The little girl's red cheeks glowed in the soft light. Despite everything, there was still innocence in her, the kind that refuses to fade even when life tries to take it away. At another table sat a man who didn't seem to belong in that small-town diner. His name was Daniel Hart. A well-dressed man in his 30s, clean-cut, his posture straight but his eyes tired, the kind of tired that sleep can't fix. A year ago, Daniel's wife had died in a car accident. Since then, his mornings had been filled with silence too heavy to bear. He came to this diner every day, not for the food, but to escape the echo of emptiness in his house. When Lily's soft eyes met his, Daniel froze. She wasn't begging. She wasn't smiling. She was just staring, at his plate of pancakes, at the golden eggs, at the crispy bacon steaming in the morning light. That look, that silent, desperate hunger, struck something deep inside him. Grace noticed it instantly. Her heart tightened. Quickly, she pulled Lily's hand and whispered, "Come on, sweetheart. Let's go." They had been judged too many times, by people who thought poverty was a choice, who believed kindness had an expiration date. Grace lowered her head and turned toward the door, her voice trembling as she said, "We shouldn't be here." But Daniel had already seen everything, the holes in her coat, the shaking in her hand, and the small girl still glancing back at his plate. Something inside him, something buried beneath grief, began to stir. He called the waitress over. "Could you bring 2 extra plates?" he said softly. Grace was just reaching for the door when the waitress's voice called out, "Ma'am. The gentleman over there said breakfast is on him, if you'd like to sit." The world seemed to stop. Grace froze, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She wanted to refuse, pride screamed at her to walk away, but then she felt Lily's small fingers tighten around hers. Lily looked up at her, hopeful. And for that single reason, Grace turned back. Daniel smiled gently, not the kind of smile that asks for anything in return, but one that says, "It's okay. You're safe." They sat down again. The waitress placed a plate in front of Lily, a stack of warm pancakes drizzled with syrup. The moment Lily's laughter filled the air, Daniel felt something inside him shift. It was a sound he hadn't heard in months. Joy. Grace whispered a soft, "Thank you." Her voice cracked halfway through. She turned to the window, pretending to look outside, but Daniel saw the tear slip quietly down her cheek. For a while, they didn't talk. The diner's soft music played in the background. Coffee cups clinked. Conversations murmured. And amid that quiet symphony, something beautiful began to heal. Daniel couldn't help watching them, the way Lily ate, the way Grace brushed the crumbs from her daughter's sweater. He saw a reflection of his late wife in both of them, the same tenderness, the same quiet strength. Emma had always believed in kindness, even when the world didn't deserve it. He used to tell her she was too soft for this life. Now, sitting there, Daniel finally understood, maybe softness was what the world needed most. When breakfast was over, Grace reached into her pocket, fumbling for coins. "Please," she said quietly, "let me pay something." Daniel shook his head gently. "It's already taken care of." Grace's eyes dropped to the table. "Thank you," she whispered again, this time with tears she couldn't hide. Outside, Daniel noticed the car parked across the street, the one that looked more like a memory than a machine. He saw Grace struggle to start it, her hand twisting the key again and again. Without hesitation, he walked over. "May I help?" he asked. Grace shook her head. "You've done enough." But when the car refused to move, she sighed, defeated. "Please," she whispered. Daniel rolled up his sleeves. Minutes later, with grease on his hands and patience in his breath, the engine finally coughed back to life. Lily clapped her hands and squealed, her laughter echoing through the cold morning air. Grace smiled, the kind of smile that looks fragile, like it might break if someone stares too long. She thanked him quietly. Daniel handed her a small folded note. "In case you ever need anything," he said. That night, as rain drummed against the roof of their old car, Grace unfolded the note again. Inside was his number and an address. For a long time, she stared at it. Then, with trembling fingers, she called. Daniel answered on the first ring. An hour later, headlights cut through the storm. Daniel stood outside their car, holding a large umbrella and 2 paper bags filled with food. He didn't ask questions. He didn't pity her. He just opened the passenger door and said softly, "You shouldn't be out here tonight." That night, he brought them to a small guest house behind his parents' old farmhouse. It was warm, quiet, and smelled faintly of fresh bread. Lily fell asleep in a real bed for the first time in weeks. Grace sat by her, tears streaming silently down her face. Daniel stood outside the door, listening to the peaceful sound of a sleeping child, a sound that filled a hole he'd thought would never heal. Days turned into weeks. Grace began helping around the farmhouse, sweeping the porch, washing dishes, leaving coffee for him every morning. Daniel never asked her to. But he'd find a new drawing on the fridge each day, stick figures of him holding Lily's hand, with the words, "Thank you, Mr. Daniel." Slowly, their broken pieces began to fit together. Grace told him how she'd lost her job when the company shut down, how she had no one left to turn to, how she tried every day to keep hope alive for Lily. Daniel shared stories of Emma, her laughter, her kindness, and how he'd lost himself after losing her. Winter faded into spring. Lily began calling him Uncle Dan. Sometimes, when Lily fell asleep on the porch, Grace would catch Daniel looking at her, not with pity, but with a quiet tenderness that words couldn't explain. Neither of them spoke about it, but both felt it. Months passed. Grace found a new job at the local elementary school. Daniel fixed her car for good. The farmhouse no longer felt empty, it felt alive again. One golden evening, Daniel came home to find Grace and Lily in the kitchen, covered in flour, baking cookies. The air smelled of sugar and laughter. Lily looked up and shouted, "Mr. Daniel, Mommy says we're staying here forever." Grace froze, blushing. "Lily," she began softly. But Daniel only smiled. He looked at them both, the woman who had taught him to live again, and the little girl who had brought light back into his world, and said, "I'd like that." That night, they went back to the same diner where it all began. Same booth, same soft lights. But this time, Grace didn't sit in shame. She laughed. Lily giggled. Daniel smiled, and for the first time since Emma's passing, his heart felt whole again. As the lights flickered gently above them, Grace looked around and whispered, "It's funny. Sometimes the smallest kindness can change everything." Daniel nodded. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "God doesn't send miracles. He sends people." And in that moment, surrounded by warmth, laughter, and the faint smell of pancakes, they all knew, they had been each other's answer all along.